At the anniversary party, I saw my husband standing in a dark corner, his hand running down Marissa's back, his ex-girlfriend. I walked up calmly and said, "Oh, honey, do you two need a room?" But instead of seeing a guilty look on his face, he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "If you can't handle this or me spending the weekend with my ex, go to hell." I didn't scream. I quietly left the party, packed my bags, and accepted the transfer to Singapore that I had turned down because of him for the past 2 years. 2 days later, while I was halfway across the world, he texted me, "How's your weekend?" So I sent him a selfie, and that was the moment he finally realized I was not the one who had to beg. My name is Eleanor, 36 years old, an elementary school teacher in Seattle, and that night was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of my life. Our 8th wedding anniversary was celebrated on a Friday evening at the Westin Hotel, in a small banquet room with just about 30 people, mostly Mason's colleagues, a few of his cousins, and my best friend Angela, a family law attorney. I had thought it was a safe party, a familiar space where I didn't have to be on guard for anything. I was chatting with Angela, talking about teaching, about the kids in my class, when my eyes drifted toward the bar. Just a small, unconscious reflex, nothing unusual. And at that exact moment, I saw Mason standing there, his hand running along the spine of Marissa, his ex-girlfriend, the woman I had once been introduced to as just the past. They were standing very close, laughing with their faces inches apart, the kind of intimacy that only exists when there are no boundaries left, no distance, no respect for the wife standing less than 10 meters away. I didn't need further proof to understand this was no accidental touch. Angela noticed immediately. She set her wineglass down on the table with a sharp motion, the look of a lawyer well acquainted with confrontations, ready to step in and restore order in her way. But I held Angela back. I said softly, just loud enough for the two of us to hear, that I would handle it myself. I walked up, placed my hand on Mason's shoulder, and said in the calmest voice I could muster, a voice I never imagined using on my own anniversary, "Oh, honey, do you two need a room?" Mason didn't let go of Marissa. He turned to look at me, his lips curling, breath heavy with the stench of alcohol, and said a sentence I know I will remember for the rest of my life. "If you can't handle this, or me spending the weekend with my ex, go to hell." Angela was standing just behind me. I could feel her anger like a wave, but I gestured for her to stop. I didn't argue, didn't scream, didn't cause a scene. I just looked at Mason as if I were seeing a man I had once known very well, but in that moment, no longer recognized at all. We left the Westin Hotel in silence, behind us the music, the lights, and a marriage I had tried to preserve for 8 years, only to realize that the most painful thing wasn't the betrayal, but the contempt shown to me, right in front of everyone, as if my existence had never mattered. That exact feeling followed me out of the Westin's lobby, trailing each step Angela and I took through the damp, cold night of Seattle, until we stopped at a late-night cafe by the Seattle waterfront, where the yellow lights spilled across the still black river, and the sound of the espresso machine thumped steadily, like a heartbeat, trying to keep everything from collapsing. We sat across from each other, neither of us speaking for the first few minutes. Angela didn't ask if I was okay, because we both knew it was a pointless question, and I stared into the steaming cup of coffee in front of me, the warmth of it far too faint to thaw the cold that had settled deep in my chest. I took a long breath and spoke bluntly, without detours or testing the waters. I said I was going to Singapore, with no prior notice, no explanation, leaving Mason with zero chance to turn the situation around. Angela looked up at me. There was no surprise in her eyes, just a sharper kind of attention, and I continued, because this wasn't some impulsive decision like people might assume. I told her that 2 years ago, when I still believed our marriage was only going through a temporary rough patch. An international elementary school in Singapore had reached out and offered me the position of principal, an opportunity many in the education field would dream of. But I declined, because Mason didn't want to move, because he said Seattle was where his career was taking off, and I chose to stay, the same way I had always chosen to put my life behind his. Just last week, a few days before our anniversary party, that school emailed me again, said the principal position was still unfilled, that they remembered me, and that the salary they were offering this time was double what I currently make. When I finished speaking, I waited in silence for Angela's response, and in that moment, I realized my voice wasn't shaking, wasn't choked, carried no tears, just strangely calm, as if this decision had been quietly forming in my subconscious for a very long time. Angela nodded slowly, placed both hands on the table, her voice dropping into the tone she used when entering serious legal territory, and she said that if I were to go, I had to go clear-headed, that I couldn't let Mason's words tonight turn into a rash act that might cost me later, that we needed evidence, not emotion, because silence only holds real power when it's backed by truth and the law. And it was that one sentence from Angela that made me sit up straighter, pull the laptop closer, as if from this moment on, I was no longer the wife trying to understand her husband's unreasonable absences, but a woman looking back on her life with a clear mind for the first time in years. We started with the smallest, most mundane things: Mason's routine, something I had never felt the need to question before, because I had grown used to him saying he needed to meet friends on the weekend, to network, to build professional relationships, and I believed him, not because I was naive, but because I had chosen to trust the man I called my husband. Angela asked me to open Mason's calendar on his phone, scattered notes, vague appointments, and when we cross-checked each weekend over the past 6 months, a pattern began to emerge so clearly it made my skin crawl. Nearly every weekend, Mason wasn't home, sometimes saying he had urgent business trips, sometimes meeting old friends. But the check-in locations he accidentally left behind through family apps I had once installed always placed him in the same area, just a few blocks from Marissa's house. I remember very clearly. There were Saturday nights when I texted him about dinner, and he replied quickly, saying he was in a late meeting. But when Angela pulled up Marissa's public social media posts, we saw her posting photos at a familiar restaurant, at the exact same time, with the same lighting, at the same window-side table I had passed many times before. At first, I told myself it was just coincidence, because I had lived so long in the habit of justifying the things that made me uncomfortable. But when we lined up Mason's work trips with Marissa's photo uploads, each timestamp matched perfectly, like two parallel lines finally revealing a point of intersection I had chosen not to see. I sat still, staring at the timestamps on the screen, not shocked anymore, not aching, but in a slow, bitter awakening that in the past 6 months, it wasn't that I hadn't seen anything. It was that I chose to look away, chose to believe that if I was patient enough, forgiving enough, everything would fall back into place. Only now realizing that the signs don't disappear when we ignore them. They simply line up quietly, waiting for the day they can no longer be denied. That day came when Angela turned the laptop toward herself and said it was time to look at the one thing that doesn't lie and doesn't pity anyone: the money trail. I logged into our joint account, the one I had only ever checked casually before, because I had trusted that Mason, as a lead engineer, knew how to manage finances better than I did, and I didn't want to be the kind of wife who questioned her husband's spending. But, as the list of transactions appeared on the screen, I realized how wrong I had been. There were payments at fine dining restaurants in Seattle, places I had passed many times, looking through their glittering glass windows and telling myself that wasn't my world, that an elementary school teacher's salary didn't allow for dinners that cost hundreds of dollars just to order items in French. There were charges from a resort in Michigan, a place Mason once told me he'd never been to, and even transactions from a high-end jewelry store, a name that made me pause for a few seconds, because it was the same place where I had once stood for a long time, gazing at sparkling rings and smiling to myself, thinking that as long as I had Mason, I didn't need any of that. Angela didn't say a word. She just let me look, compare, understand. And it was that silence that made everything clearer than any explanation could. Then came the smaller transactions, repeated hotel charges, all linked to the same familiar chain. And in that moment, a very specific memory surfaced in my mind, so vivid it chilled me. I remembered a time, months ago, while doing Mason's laundry, I found a hotel receipt in his pocket. I picked it up, skimmed it, and put it back, telling myself he must have forgotten to take it out, that it was for work, that I shouldn't overthink it. But now, that receipt was no longer an isolated slip of paper. It was part of a long string of financial footprints, and I understood that the moment I placed it back in his pocket wasn't an act of trust. It was a refusal to face the truth. I sat in silence, not crying, not trembling, just feeling a deep emptiness opening in my chest, where once I had filled myself with reassurances that everything would be okay. And in that void, I began to understand that my marriage didn't fall apart in one night at the Westin. It had been breaking for a long time, with every dollar that left our account unasked. Every time I told myself that love meant silence, only now realizing that the money trail didn't just reveal Mason's betrayal, but expose the way I had traded my own safety for blind faith for far too long. And while that emptiness still echoed quietly in my chest, Angela gently said, "There was one more place we had to look. One that many believe will erase everything with a single delete. iCloud." I logged into the shared account Mason had suggested we use early in our marriage, saying there should be no secrets between us, and that line now echoed in my head like a bitter mockery. We scrolled down to the deleted messages, conversations Mason thought he had erased well enough to never be found. But iCloud doesn't forget as easily as people do, and the fragments that appeared on the screen, though incomplete, were enough to piece together a picture I could no longer deny. The tone between Mason and Marissa wasn't two old friends checking in out of politeness. It was pet names, reassurances, short phrases wrapped in familiarity, the kind that comes only when two people know each other too well, as if the breakup 10 years ago had never happened. I read each line slowly, not because I needed more time to understand them, but because I was trying to adjust to the feeling of watching my husband speak to another woman in a tone he hadn't used with me in a very long time. Then, Angela opened the voice memos, short recordings Marissa had sent Mason, often during times he said he was driving. The same hours he'd text me saying he couldn't talk. Traffic was heavy. He'd speak when he got home. In those recordings, Marissa's voice came through clearly, intimately, with no background noise of the road as I had once imagined, only whispers, private questions, and soft laughter I knew couldn't belong to a harmless friendship. I muted the sound, because I didn't need to hear the rest to understand that the moments Mason was absent from my life had been fully lived in someone else's. I sat there, staring at the cold, glowing screen in front of me. And for the first time, I no longer felt that sharp, explosive pain. What I felt instead was a clarity, harsh and exact, that betrayal doesn't always arrive in grand, dramatic scenes. Sometimes it lives quietly, in messages not quite erased, in rushed voice notes, in the mistaken belief that technology can hide what the heart has already stopped bothering to conceal. In that moment, Angela closed the laptop, not to avoid the truth, but to mark a clear boundary between discovery and action. She opened a new folder, naming it slowly, carefully, as if every word carried its own legal weight. Evidence to protect divorce rights. I looked at the folder name appearing on the screen, and it felt entirely different from the vague suspicions I had harbored over the past 6 months, because this was no longer about feelings, no longer the intuition of a neglected wife, but a complete file, chronological, documented, and able to withstand scrutiny from anyone who might try to deny it. Angela dragged each item into that folder. Mason's movement logs, check-in locations, screenshots of Marissa's posts, bank statements, hotel receipts, the undeleted iCloud messages, and the voice memos I hadn't had the courage to fully listen to. Each file named by date and time, devoid of emotion, commentary, or context. just raw facts, neatly arranged. She told me in a calm, even voice that in cases like this, the real danger isn't the betrayal itself, but the ambiguity, because as long as I was still wondering if I might be misinterpreting things, I would remain at a disadvantage. But with what lay in this folder, there was no room for misinterpretation anymore. Angela looked me straight in the eye and said the thing I had known for a long time, but had never dared to name, that Marissa was not a harmless echo from the past knocking on our door. She was the present that Mason had actively chosen, weekend after weekend, transaction after transaction, message after message, lie after lie. I nodded, not because I had just realized it, but because I was finally allowing myself to accept it without softening it, without making excuses for anyone. And in that exact moment, as the evidence folder was saved, I knew my marriage was officially over. Not with a fight, not with tears, but with an undeniable conclusion, where I no longer stood in the position of a betrayed woman, but as someone who had faced the truth and was now ready to step into the next chapter of her life, with the clarity I should have had long ago. And in that state of clarity, I drove home alone, unlocked the door, and stepped into a house once called a home, where everything was still exactly as before, quiet enough that I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Mason came home at 1 a.m., the door swinging open harder than necessary, the smell of alcohol flooding the familiar air like a signal I had long learned to recognize, the stench that always accompanied the nights he disappeared and returned as if nothing had happened. He didn't ask where I had been that evening, didn't mention the party at the West Inn. He tossed his keys on the kitchen counter, took off his jacket, and said in a tired, slightly irritated tone that I was overreacting again, that he and Marissa were just friends, that I was reading too much into things. I stood there, watching him speak, and for the first time in years, I felt no need to justify my feelings, no need to offer evidence, no need to argue about boundaries, because I had done all of that already, over and over, throughout this marriage. I stayed silent, not because I didn't have answers, but because I had too many, and no reason to share them with someone who never truly wanted to hear them. In that moment, I realized that the phrase, "we're just friends," no longer carried the weight of an excuse. It was just a habit, repeated often enough to mask the contempt that had seeped into the way Mason saw me, as if my emotions were just inconvenient reactions to be silenced rather than something worthy of respect. I said nothing because I needed no further explanations, and it was that silence, calm and resolute, that marked the last time I stood in that kitchen as a wife still hoping things could be salvaged. The next morning arrived with a calmness that felt almost cruel, as if no insults had been spoken the night before. Mason woke up late, close to 9 a.m., stepped out of the bedroom with messy hair and the sluggish face of a man still heavy with drink. Not a single apology, not even a glance that hinted he understood his words, had crossed every boundary of a normal marriage. He opened the fridge, poured coffee, checked his phone. Routine movements of a man who believed everything in the house would continue as usual, that I would still be there, quietly cleaning up the mess left by his emotions. I stood in the hallway, watching those tiny actions, and for the first time, I no longer wondered why I felt so empty, because I was witnessing a habit repeated so many times it had become a given in Mason's world. He changed clothes, grabbed his car keys, and said flatly that he was going to meet a friend, his tone identical to every other weekend, with no explanation, no permission asked, no concern for what I might think. I looked out the window as Mason's car rolled out of the driveway, and just minutes later, the location ping on the tracking app appeared. Clear, direct, unmistakable, leading straight to the neighborhood where Marissa lived, the exact route I had seen too many times over the past 6 months. In that moment, I didn't feel pain or anger anymore, just a clear confirmation that this wasn't a momentary lapse, not the result of alcohol or a reckless night, but a pattern repeated with the confidence of a man who believed he would never face consequences. I stood there for a long time, listening to the door click shut behind me, and understood that my decision no longer belonged to some distant future. It was being written out clearly in this seemingly ordinary morning, where Mason chose the same old path, and I, for the first time, was ready to take a different one, quietly, without warning, but irreversible. As the sound of Mason's car engine faded completely from the driveway and the door clicked shut behind him, I walked into the bedroom and pulled the large suitcase from the corner of the closet, the one I had used only for short trips with him over the years, never imagining I'd one day open it to leave alone. I unzipped it slowly, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be certain that everything I put inside belonged to me. No confusion, no ambiguity. I started with the important documents: birth certificate, marriage license, diplomas, personal records I had stored safely in the bottom drawer. Then my passport, untouched for years, because I had always prioritized Mason's schedule over my own opportunities. I took the printed copy of my new job contract, neatly clipped in a slim folder, and my personal laptop, the one I used every night to prepare lesson plans, items that represented the part of me that had existed before I became someone's wife. I packed a few essential pieces of clothing, not thinking about what Mason liked to see me wear, not planning for parties or shared gatherings, just simple items enough for me to live, work, and care for myself somewhere else. I didn't take anything Mason had bought for me, not because they no longer held material value, but because I didn't want to carry anything tied to the silence I once exchanged in order to preserve a marriage rotting from the inside out. As the suitcase gradually filled, I realized it wasn't as heavy as I had imagined, because what I was carrying wasn't 8 years of memories, but only what I truly needed to begin again. And for the first time that morning, I felt very clearly that I wasn't running away. I was simply packing up my life, the way I should have done a long time ago. When the clock read 5:30 p.m., I called an Uber to the airport. A simple act that felt so effortless it surprised even me, because the real decision had been made the night before, the moment I sat alone with my laptop open on the booking page and chose the late-night flight from Seattle to Singapore without asking anyone's opinion. I remember the feeling as I clicked confirm. No anxiety, no trembling, just a cold, clear certainty that I wasn't going to turn back. Before leaving the house, I took one slow lap around the living room, not to reminisce, but to make sure I hadn't left any part of myself behind in this place, then stopped at the vanity, where the old wedding ring box had sat untouched for 8 years. I opened the lid, placed the house key inside, and closed it gently, just as I had once tried so hard to keep our marriage looking intact from the outside. I left no note, no explanation, no warning, because boundaries don't need to be written in long paragraphs. They only need to be set clearly and never moved again. As the door closed behind me, I rolled my suitcase out, stepped into the car, and watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror. And for the first time, I understood that this departure wasn't a reckless response to pain. It was the result of hundreds of times I had asked myself whether I was still respected, and finally chose the only answer that let me keep my dignity. The plane landed at Changi Airport after a long-haul flight. I wheeled my suitcase out through the arrivals gate, exhausted in the familiar way that only transoceanic travel brings. But mentally, I felt more alert than ever, as if everything I'd left behind had been properly placed in its final spot. The moment I reconnected my phone, the screen lit up with a flood of messages from Mason. Line after line, no longer carrying the usual confidence or superiority, but the panic of a man who just realized that what he thought was permanent could vanish at any moment. I didn't read them immediately. I stood still among the stream of people at the airport, listening to the boarding announcements echo around me, and finally opened the one message that made my heart ache in a very different way. Not from love, but from the starkness of the truth. Mason wrote that he was at Marissa's house, but wanted to talk to me, as if those two things didn't contradict each other, as if I were still the place he could return to for stability while standing in another woman's space. I stared at that message for a long time, and for the first time, I didn't feel defeated, only a sharp clarity that every word from him from this moment on had lost its weight. I rolled my suitcase outside and stood in front of Marina Bay Sands, glowing bright in the Singapore night, the lights reflecting off the glass like a solid wall separating me from my old life. I lifted my phone and took a selfie, an unposed, expressionless photo of a woman who had just walked out of a years-long illusion. I sent the picture without a single word attached, and 4 seconds later, my phone buzzed again. Mason's reply, typed entirely in uppercase, asking if I was really in Singapore, as if only now he began to understand that my silence wasn't some temporary tantrum. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because in that moment, standing before Marina Bay Sands, I knew very clearly that this selfie wasn't sent to hurt him. It was sent to end, once and for all, Mason's final illusion that I would always be there, waiting for him to turn back whenever he pleased. After I moved to Singapore, Angela didn't file for divorce right away because she knew that some truths need to be placed in the right setting before being brought to light. And that setting wasn't a shouting match between husband and wife, but the very place where Mason had built his reputation and authority. She sent a complete file of infidelity evidence to the board of directors at the construction firm, where Mason held the position of lead engineer, void of emotion, absent of accusations, just a carefully worded legal email with full attachments. Hotel photos, travel logs, matching timestamps, expense receipts, undeleted iCloud messages, and properly formatted witness statements. The person who handled the case directly was the company's CEO, a woman nearing 60, and when Angela told me that she despised cheating men, I thought it was just a side note, until I later learned that she herself had been betrayed by her husband in the past, and ever since had refused to tolerate leaders who disregarded family boundaries or personal ethics. Mason was summoned to a closed-door meeting with the board on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. No warning, no media, no time to prep a story or shift the blame. There was no argument, no opportunity to explain, because what lay on the table wasn't the emotional outcry of a wronged wife. It was a sequence of logical, consistent, and undeniable evidence. The decision was made that very day. Mason was terminated for violating ethical standards of leadership. All projects he had overseen were revoked. His office access card was deactivated, and in the span of a single afternoon, the reputation of a lead engineer he had spent over 15 years building collapsed entirely. Not because I spoke up, but because the truth was finally placed exactly where it belonged. While Mason was still reeling from losing everything in a single afternoon, on another front, Angela quietly finished her role without ever attaching her name. Using an anonymous Facebook account, no profile picture, no personal info, she posted the full evidence showing that Marissa had been in an affair with a married man. The post was presented clearly, following a precise timeline, without added emotion or moral commentary, just letting the truth speak for itself. The post spread faster than anything we'd expected, because the internet doesn't take long to spot the disconnect between the image Marissa had cultivated, a strong, independent, inspirational woman, and the reality behind those heavily edited photos. Within 72 hours, Marissa's TikTok following plummeted, from 1.8 million down to 87,000. The drop was so fast that even her PR team couldn't react in time. Brand sponsors began pulling out one after another, not due to rumors, but because of pre-existing morality clauses in each contract, followed by claims for damages for harm to brand image. Her ad revenue vanished in a matter of days, fines stacked up, and within less than 2 months, the woman who had once lived under the spotlight of live streams and luxury vacations officially filed for bankruptcy. I didn't follow her downfall day by day because I didn't need to watch to feel vindicated. I only knew that when an image is built entirely on lies, all it takes is one direct beam of light for everything to fall apart, irreversibly. And when the glow of social media faded, what remained between Mason and Marissa wasn't love or understanding. It was two people standing amid the rubble of their own making. Mason lost his job, his position, the thing he once proudly called a career. Marissa lost her platform, her persona, the livelihood she had built through followers and sponsorships, and when there was nothing left to shield them, they began blaming each other instinctively. Mason said Marissa ruined his life, that if not for her, he wouldn't have been caught, wouldn't have been fired, wouldn't have become gossip among the engineering circles he once belonged to. Marissa fired back, accusing Mason of deceit, of using her image to feed the ego of a man who craved admiration, that he dragged her into a dead-end relationship and left her to face the consequences alone. Their arguments no longer took place behind closed doors. They spilled out into the public in leaked messages, screenshots of chats, angry rants typed too fast to delete in time. Enough for anyone to see that a relationship once cloaked in parties, lavish weekends, and familiar lies had rotted beyond repair. I took no part in any of it because I understood this wasn't my story anymore. It was simply the inevitable outcome for two people who chose betrayal and believed they would never have to pay for it. They ended things bitterly, full of blame and resentment, with nothing left but the stark truth that when everything collapses, love isn't the first thing to go. It's the illusion that happiness can be built on someone else's pain. Months later, I stood in a courtroom for my own divorce hearing with a feeling entirely different from what I had once imagined. There were no fights, no harsh accusations, just procedures carried out by law, where assets and the Seattle house were divided clearly and fairly, like the final calculation closing a chapter of life. No one won, no one lost, because this wasn't a contest, but a just conclusion for two people who had reached their limit. Mason signed the papers in silence, no eye contact, no words, as if every explanation by then was already irrelevant. I signed my name with a steady hand, no tremble, no pause, because I knew exactly what I was signing for, not to hold on, but to let go. I didn't need revenge, didn't need to prove I was right. Life had already done that for me in ways I never had to interfere with. A few days later, standing on the balcony of my small apartment overlooking the Singapore River, I listened quietly as the city lit up around me, the water drifting under the reflected glow of skyscrapers. And in that moment, I realized something with absolute clarity. When a woman stops enduring in silence, when she sets boundaries and walks away without asking for permission, not only does her own life shift, but the entire system that once relied on her quiet compliance is forced to move as well, leaving behind a space wide enough for freedom, for peace, and for a future that, for the first time, I had the right to choose for myself. I'm not a perfect person, and the decisions I made may not be the same ones you would make. But if my journey made you feel a little less alone, or gave you just a bit more courage to draw your own lines, then this story has meant something. If you feel seen, please hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories. Stories of women who were once silent and who learned to walk forward on their own 2 feet. Thank you for listening.